Hi, everyone. Hello, hello. Let's get a little uneasy here today. We're going to talk about democracy and where it is. And we're not going to talk about it only in the US. We don't want to be chastised for getting it wrong out of the gate. My name is Kahlil Byrd. I go by KB. And I am a proud member of the class of 2003 mid-career program. We just did 3 hours of check-ins, and half of my classmates have lost their voice, so they won't be asking any questions today. I don't think that's true. Since I graduated in 2020, since I graduated 20 years ago in 2003, I have spent my time in the democracy reform movement here in the United States as a practitioner. One of the great things about doing this is that you get books, especially when you're on the panel with smart people. And we have the smartest that Harvard Kennedy School has to offer. But I've been a practitioner, helping to build democratic institutions in the US and supporting those leaders specifically who in their leadership at the state and federal level have democracy as one of their planks. And that's been one of the joys of my life, even in these challenging times. So we enter this conversation in a moment of difficulty that I think we can all acknowledge, but here's a few statistics. I'll start with the US. According to Pew, only 19% of Americans today say they trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Pandemic and challenge around that. According to the General Survey, which I think is out of University of Chicago, and I think this makes a lot of people sad, only 18% of Americans say they trust the United States Supreme Court. That is the lowest level in 50 years. Truly respected organization, going to International Freedom House. In its annual report on the state of the world, it lays out the challenges to democracy. What we're seeing in countries around the world is systematic attacks on freedom of expression, which includes the suppression of media freedom in more than 150 countries and territories. In 1974, 30% of countries that they surveyed were considered free. Now this is good. In 2022, 50% are considered free, but there are more countries that they're surveying, so let's not all get excited about that. And when you think about what our experts know about Brexit, China, Russia, India, the pandemic, the effect of the Ukraine war, and a greater demand culture, for example, coming out of different communities and especially the global south, we're in a challenging time for democracy. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, we'll have some conversation, and then we're going to have very short questions from the audience grouped in threes so that we can get a lot in. And I'll be a little bit more strict than I would normally want to be. So Archon Fung, you are the Winthrop, Laflin, McCormack Professor of Citizenship and Self-Governance here at HKS. You are also, something very important to a lot of people, the director of the Ash Carter Center for Democratic...
Not Ash Carter, different Ash.
Oh, sorry, Ash.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Thank you. The Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. You will talk a lot about the US and some of our changes. Pippa, you are the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics here at HKS. You have been studying and teaching about comparative politics for more than 3 decades, and you've written many, many books, as have all of our colleagues here. You are the founding director of the Election Integrity Project, and you were at one time the director of UNDP's Democratic Governance Program. Tarek Masoud, you are the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Government here at HKS. You are the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy for the National Endowment for Democracy. And you serve as the faculty director of the Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. So let's get into it. So Archon, we're going to level set. We're in an environment of rigor. And what we need is a definition of democracy, and who decides that definition, and who decides that a democracy is a democracy.
Great. Well, small question. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for that generous introduction, and I really welcome the discussion this afternoon. So I'm a political philosopher, so I will offer a appropriately abstract idea of democracy. So democracy, to me, is just a way of settling the deep differences that exist in any society. Big questions, like how do you determine at a social level who is God, what truth is, whether women should have a right to choose, or whether fetal life is more important, whether preventing gun violence is the priority, or whether bearing arms is more important, whether you should let the free market rip and those who do very well should do very well, or whether more equal distribution of resources are required. In our society and every society, people have deep, deep disagreements about those things. For most of human history, those disagreements have not been resolved through any sort of democratic process. They've been resolved by kings, hereditary monarchies, military juntas, civil wars. Democracy is a distinctive process for settling those disagreements. And I want to offer a minimal idea of democracy and then a more maximal. And then there's lots of views in between. A minimal idea of democracy, first articulated, I think, by Joseph Schumpeter in a book in the 1950s. The idea is that all democracy requires is a couple parties competing for people's votes, and then whoever gets the most votes gets to decide, not exactly in the United States who God is, but a bunch of those other questions. And so it doesn't really matter all that much if women don't get to vote or minorities get to vote, just so as long as enough people get to vote and there's more than one party vying for power and the winner of the most votes gets to rule. And that's minimal democracy. And that leaves a lot on the table. But what's really good about minimal democracy is at least you get the peaceful transfer of power, not to be taken for granted. A more maximal idea of democracy is that the laws and policies and answers to those big questions should be determined by the people. Somehow what their preferences are, what their views are, what the result of their arguments and debates with one another are. Those should get transferred into law and public policy. Somehow, whether it's a deliberative, whether it's through a fully inclusive voting process, et cetera. I'm much more on the maximal side, just to say, but that is a disagreement. There are many, many minimal Democrats out there as well. So why don't I leave it at that?
So, Pippa, we're going to start, thank you for that. We're going to start global, and we're going to try to use your discipline, comparative politics, as the frame to try to get a sense of how you define democracies based on the countries that you're studying, one versus the other.
Thank you. And I very much appreciate seeing everybody again. It's good to have you back in Cambridge, and welcome back, even if the weather is not with us. Let's build on this idea that what's been declining perhaps in democracy is not some of the core things, but liberal democracy in particular. The idea of freedom of the press, for example, with the persecution of journalists. Elections which are free and fair, which we know there are problems in many countries around the world, not just in the United States, where losers challenge the results. Challenges to the independence of the judiciary and the courts, who are seen as partisan versus people who are there for their expertise. Challenges to civil society in general and human rights. So what's going on? What I'd like to do is give you kind of 7 potential explanations which we could debate, we could think about. And you've heard some of these, I'm sure, before, but really we need to think, what is the real reason why democracy, after a long period of expansion, after all, democracy in its expansion period was going on from the 1970s right through to around 2010, why should it suddenly reverse? Not just in America, but in many other countries. If I have to ask you, for example, in India, under Modi, in Venezuela, under Chavez and Maduro, if I was to ask you in other countries like Hungary, under Viktor Orban, or cases which we all are very familiar with in a number of other countries. So here's some of the explanations. So the first one, which is always being put forward, it's the economics, it's the economy, stupid, right? People say that what's happened is a change in manufacturing industry, where that's been on the decline in the Rust Belt, and people have lost their jobs, the blue-collar workers. As a result, they feel that they're angry by their economic status, and therefore that's why they're supporting authoritarian populist parties and leaders in order to really speak back against all of those who have benefited, like probably many of us. Seems a plausible explanation, right? But let's think of some of the cases. Does it fit? And let's think about Erdogan right now with the election, first round. I know we're going to come to it a little later, but he is ahead. He's likely to be returned after about 20 years in power. Inflation in Turkey right now is estimated between 50 and 100%. I mean, it's just out of this world. It's even worse in Lebanon, I know, but it's really bad. And the economic performance has been bad. The performance in terms of humanitarian disasters has been bad after the 2 earthquakes and rebuilding and the standards of housing and so on. So economics can't explain his appeal. Nor can it explain many of the other leaders. Hungary, for example, in fact, had economic growth quite substantially from 2010 onwards. And yet, Viktor Orban has been elected again and again, 15 years in power. And it doesn't fit Sweden, it doesn't fit Finland, it doesn't fit many of the countries which have got these sorts of parties and leaders. And they're the most affluent in the world, and they're the strongest welfare states, the most egalitarian in taxes. So for all of us in Cambridge who think if only we had a better welfare state in America, Trump would not be elected, well, Sweden says no. Second explanation, briefly, migration. Population changes. We all know about the issue of the border wall in America, but of course the refugee crisis in 2016 in Europe was again a major impact, people said, on support, for example, in Germany for the AfD, or in Hungary for Viktor Orban. Build a wall against the Syrians, build a wall against the Afghans. Problem is, since 2016, that issue has gone down in its importance, according to the public. After the big refugee crisis, things have been contained much more. There's still problems, but nevertheless, that's not the issue in number one, nor is it in America. Even amongst Republicans, when you look at the most important issues right now in the current polls, it's the economy which is up there, not refugees or migrants or others. And again, of course, there have been countries who are very much authoritarian populist, who are in fact the net beneficiaries. They send their people abroad to get jobs, like in Poland, and yet law and justice is strong. International relations is the third explanation. So it's the rising power of China, Russia, but also many other places, Saudi Arabia more assertive, Syria coming back into the fold, Venezuela and so on. A plausible explanation, maybe the West has been asleep, maybe we haven't been putting enough money and resources and technical aid into democracy assistance, and I know that from my own work at UNDP. But there has to be national ownership of any of those initiatives. You can't simply impose democracy. Look at Afghanistan, absolute disaster. How many billions were wasted there of blood and treasure? If the country isn't ready for it, if the people aren't supporting it, if there's very little sense that it's going to work, and if there's high levels of corruption, you can't just impose democracy on another country. And so, again, that explanation is partly true, but it's not the whole story by any means. And it obviously can't explain most of the cases I've just referred to, which are in fact middle-income countries. Think about France and Le Pen. Think about Germany. Think about Finland. Mass communications, a fourth explanation, briefly. We all know the role of disinformation, it's claimed, which has suddenly sprung up all of a sudden on the internet. Well, the internet's been around since 1995. It didn't start yesterday. And we've always had social media, which are electronic, and we've always had other forms of propaganda, which are disinformation. Propaganda is the oldest thing in the world. Think about Hitler's Germany. So again, it's another word for it, it's a new way of thinking about it, and certainly it's pervasive, and certainly it's a problem, but is it the cause of all of these long-term changes? I'd argue no. It's just not strong enough as an impact. Leadership studies, briefly. I know I'm going on for too long, but leadership studies say it's the individuals who came in. It's a particular aggressive, transgressive character. The type of leader who wants to be basically, as somebody called them, the drunken guest at a dinner party, who wants to be pushing back on the good manners and against all this politeness and against this kind of, give and take and bargaining and compromise and all the things that liberals love. Instead of that, we've had another type of leader. But why would they suddenly appear? Why in India, after all of those years and decades of democracy? Why in America, when we've had Republicans and Democrats who've been very similar in their attitudes and their characteristics? Why would you suddenly get a transgressive politician in many places? Why would you get a Johnson in the Conservative Party? Institutions is the sixth explanation, and then I'll finish off with my explanation, you'll be glad to know. Institutions are about the weaknesses that we build into the rules of the game, the formal rules, not just the democratic norms, but the ways in which we structure power to get things done. Trouble is that, again, authoritarian populists have risen in presidential systems, they've risen in parliamentary systems. They've risen in countries which have got proportional representation elections, where small parties get elected. In many cases, that's the case. But they've also risen in countries with majoritarian elections, first past the post, like in the United Kingdom and the United States. So the institutions are flawed, particularly when they're weak. Most of the countries which have backslid have been the ones which I would term electoral democracies. They haven't really got strong institutions to check the executive, that's true. But that's not the whole explanation. And again, we've had strong presidents in the past who've pushed at those rules. So we can't suddenly say everything changed in 2016. So the last explanation is the one I'm favouring, and that's from my book with Ron Inglehart. Unfortunately, we have lost him, but he was the major philosopher and theorist of social change and value change. And the simple argument which we make is this. There's essentially been a long-term shift over generations amongst the population in terms of social diversity, educated populations who've gone to college, the growth of gender equality, changes in attitudes towards sexuality and sexual identities, changes in attitudes towards religion with a growing role of secularization, changes in a variety of different values that we have. And in the 60s, that's when it kind of started in our view. That was a minority view. Students, yes, probably you and I and others were part of that, but not everybody was. By the way, when I look around this generation, I think maybe all of you were part of that movement.
Are you saying they're old? Or?
No, I'm not, because I'm saying they're of that generation. But anyway, the problem was that it was a small group, but it gradually just expanded. Think about, for example, tolerance of homosexuality, which was really something that started, I think, in terms of broad value changes in the 1960s and 70s, and now is mainstream. Think about, for example, same-sex marriage. What couldn't be talked about, now mainstream in many countries. Mm-hmm. The trouble is that that long-term liberal arc has produced losers, cultural losers, people who feel that their values are not respected, the values of faith and religion, the values of family and traditional marriage and binary gender identities, and the values also of flag and patriotism and nationalism. And that group is a large group, but it's becoming a minority. I estimate it's around the 40% of Americans, for example, are in that socially conservative values. Mm-hmm. So it's still strong, and it's still enough when people are mobilized, and this is a group that votes and is mobilized because they're angry and because they are more likely to turn out, unlike young people who unfortunately often do not vote. And that's the group which is declining in population, but is still large enough to elect an Erdogan, elect a Modi, elect Donald Trump, and a DeSantis, potentially. So that's the story. I'll finish there. Yeah. But there are lots of explanations, and I'd love to hear from your experience of different countries, which ones you think really apply to you and your own experience.
Thank you. So Tarek, I'm a practitioner, so I won't hand you a book, but I'll try to hand you an organization or a candidate. And I consider myself a political entrepreneur. Yeah. And you have developed a theory, and people are accepting it, about building democracies where they don't exist, where they haven't been. Building democracy in hard places. Yeah. Can you just kind of unpack that for us?
Sure. Let me, if you don't mind, just address something that came up in the conversation that we actually had in the green room, which I think it would be productive and generative, because KB came away from our conversation saying, hey, Tarek, you seem pretty optimistic, actually, and pretty upbeat about at least American democracy. And the reason I seem upbeat about democracy in America actually hinges on my definition of democracy. So Professor Fung talked about people who adhere to a minimal definition of democracy, which says democracy is a system of government in which people acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. That's a direct quote from Schumpeter. And then there are other folks who have more maximal positions who say, no, in fact, democracy it must be judged by what it produces. So unless a system of government, for example, produces economic rights, unless a system of government produces equality among people, regardless of worldview or lifestyle, then it's not worth being called a democracy. And I am actually a minimalist, in part because I think the minimal conception of democracy is not as negligible as Professor Fung described it. Think about what you need to have in order to have free and fair elections, because that actually is a key rock bottom criterion here. I've got to have freedom of association, freedom of speech. I have to have all of these things that I think are pretty substantial, that we all care about. And I do think in the American case, those things are not under dramatic threat, okay? Moreover, okay, so then you might, now somebody who disagrees with me, by the way, is Professor Norris. Professor Norris has this fantastic project called the Electoral Integrity Project, where they go around and they measure how free and fair and full of integrity elections are. And in fact, they have made the argument that some American states have worse elections than places like Indonesia, Sierra Leone, or Cuba. I don't agree with that, but that's a claim that people are making. So why am I a minimalist? It's because I study a part of the world that doesn't even have that minimal electoral conception of democracy that my beloved Professor Fung dismissed so quickly, all right? So if you think about the countries that I study, which are primarily the Muslim majority Arabic-speaking countries of the Middle East, not a single one of them at this late date in human history is a liberal democracy, is even a minimal democracy. And so the question then is, how do we get them to be democracies? And there are really two perspectives here. One perspective says, you know, there's not a whole lot that you can do. The political regime that a country enjoys is a function of certain characteristics that come about through long historical, political, social, and economic processes. So in order for you to have a democracy, you must have a fairly affluent and educated population. You have to have a strong administrative apparatus that has the monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in the territory, that's actually able to do things like collect taxes, pick up the garbage off of the street, deliver some social welfare, deliver some education. That's not trivial. Then there are some nice to have things like, well, it would be good, some of these scholars say, if your society were not riven by deep ethnic and religious cleavages. It would be good if you were in a neighborhood with some other democracies. It turns out that one of the most robust associations of lack of democracy is being embedded in a region that doesn't have democracy. So there are all of these structural preconditions for democracy. And if you, that, at least some scholars say, and if you're of that school, you would say, okay, if I want to bring democracy, that means I've got to work on strengthening the administrative apparatus, I've got to work on developing the economy, I've got to actually do a whole bunch of things that to some people might look like helping and strengthening an authoritarian regime. But the idea is that over time, the society will develop, it will modernize, and then democracy will fall like a ripe fruit from a tree. That's somebody's line. I'm plagiarizing it. I just can't remember who said it. There's an alternative perspective. There's an alternative conception that looks at a place like India, that looks like a place like Indonesia, that looks like at a place like Timor-Leste. These are all poor countries that lack these quote-unquote democratic prerequisites, but that managed to have democracy for a long period of time. And people who look at those examples say, you know, political entrepreneurs like yourself, KB, like our Kennedy School students, can do a lot to bring democracy to quote-unquote hard places that don't have it. And what's needed then is political elites who have commitment to democracy, strategic acumen, the power and ability to mobilize people and resources in the service of democracy, that have the ability to build coalitions across classes and ideologies in order to create genuine challenges to autocratic, dictatorial, despotic regimes. And in such places, if those things exist, you can actually get democracy. And the problem is, as Professor Norris described, in those democracies in hard places, the challenges to democratic survival are legion. And so you see, as Professor Norris mentioned, in India, democracy, some scholars say today that India, which was single-handedly the rejoinder to the structural explanations for democratic emergence. Like anytime you'd say, oh, you need to be a rich country to get democracy, people say, what about India? Oh, you need to have ethnic homogeneity to get democracy. People say, what about India? Now India is no longer that rejoinder, and lots of people say that India today is a competitive authoritarian regime. In my part of the world, the one liberal democracy that we had, Tunisia, okay, got democracy in 2011 as a result of a great uprising of the people during the so-called Arab Spring. And that democracy hung on for about 10 years until the summer of 2021, when a democratically elected president who declared himself, interestingly, he would say, if I describe the minimal conception of democracy, he'd say, no, democracy must be much more than that. I'm a popular rule Democrat. And then, of course, what did he do? Close the parliament, put a bunch of people in jail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why did that happen? It happened in part because people really felt that democracy was not delivering, okay? Their economic conditions experienced a real deterioration in that period. They came to associate democracy with fecklessness, with disorder, and even with corruption, okay? The other reason I do think is because there is around the world this, as Professor Norris mentioned, kind of assertive authoritarianism, where non-democratic regimes are pointing to records of success. Think China, think Singapore. And people are saying, well, China and Singapore, I'd much rather be China or Singapore than be the United States, where people are storming the Capitol and doing all of these crazy things. And then finally, I think a lack of interest on the part of the world's democracies, like our own country, and I hope Professor Fung will speak about this, a lack of interest in really promoting democracy around the world. And so when I think about what do we need to get and keep democracy in these hard places, and I'm going to stop here, one of the big things I think we really need is for the United States to be a little bit more committed to helping democracies along where the people finally manage to establish them. I'll stop there, I have more to say. But
I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We're going to do a little US.
Yeah, great.
So those of us who came here, let's call it 98 to 2004, 5, and 6. I graduated in 2003, Bush v. Gore, 9/11, the rise of terrorism, the fear of terrorism, push our invasion of Iraq, push forward, 2016. It's been kind of head spinning.
It has been.
You wrote a piece recently which says the thing that is the spine that goes through there is the big lie, which I hadn't actually attributed before. That I think most people would put that at 2016. Archon. Yeah. So please.
Yeah, good. So I think that I do want to talk about American democracy now and kind of bring it back a little bit. And I want to put forward the proposition that's what's really different now in American politics is that the range of political disagreement is just much, much wider than when you were at the Kennedy School when I started teaching here in 1999, 2000. And here's a way of illustrating that. Bush v. Gore, this is a great audience because you actually lived through Bush v. Gore, so I can talk about it, and you know what I'm talking about.
People in the audience worked on both sides.
Yeah, right. And so one of I think the best speeches in American politics ever is Al Gore's concession speech, and you remember that? He says, "Look, I didn't think it would end up this way. I actually think I got more votes, but the Supreme Court decided." And it's not my call. It's their call, and that's why I'm stepping down, and that's why I wish George W. Bush the best of luck, and I will support him in any way possible. Now, when you heard, whatever side you were on, if you heard that speech and remember that episode, how many of you think, yeah, Al Gore, that is what America is about? Like, that's democracy in action. Raise your hand. Certainly. Now,
peaceful transition of power.
Yeah, now imagine a similar scenario in 2024. It's your deep view. The Electoral College hangs on the popular vote in Florida. You actually believe, it's a Biden-Trump election. You actually believe that Biden got more votes, and so does every respectable vote counter. But the Florida legislature throws its electors for Donald J. Trump. The Democrats sue left and right. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, relying on Moore v. Harper, which hasn't been decided yet, and Bush v. Gore 2001, decides Donald J. Trump is the President of the United States. How many of you would want Joe Biden to give the speech that Al Gore gave? Far fewer. I'm divided, right?
I don't know if I should vote as moderator.
Right. And so that's
views.
the sense in which we're in a wide aperture world. Like if you're for Al Gore and the Supreme Court decides that George W. Bush is going to be president, like it hurts. That's a tough sting, but like it's going to be okay. Tomorrow's pretty much going to be like yesterday in most regards. I think why a lot of people did not raise their hand is maybe you're not sure tomorrow will be like yesterday if the Supreme Court decides against what you and many other people regard as a fair count in Florida that Donald J. Trump should be the president again. So the sense in which we're a wide aperture world is that in that Bush or Clinton, Bush, first term Obama world, the range of disagreement between political elites in America was very little. We agreed on globalization. We agreed mostly on markets. We agreed, I think, at least in voice, on a racially inclusive meritocracy. We agreed on U.S. as being a power in the world. We agreed on the retrenchment of the welfare state. I remember I first started teaching here in 1999. And some of you may have heard me say this. I used to teach a class on the universal basic income. And students would say, why are you teaching us this like left crazy stuff? It wouldn't work. The world would melt down. It's a terrible idea. You're wasting my time. And now when I teach it, students say, why are you teaching me this? It's obvious we should do this, right? So that's a sense in which the political debate has changed. It's not that there weren't MAGA people or AOC Bernie people in the 2000s. There were. They just couldn't get into the political debate. And now the political debate, all of this is on the table. And as a democracy, I think we just lack the muscles to process that wide aperture debate. And the weak muscles there to process a wide range of disagreement manifest a bunch of the political fragility that we see, the democratic fragility that we see today. And let me just kind of end this part with some of the indicators, what I consider indicators of democratic fragility in American politics. And some of these touch the minimal idea, but most do not. Right? One that does touch the minimal idea is right now 36% of Republicans and 33% of Democratic identifiers say that they feel that it is sometimes justified to use violence to achieve political goals. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot. In the 2012-14 period, it was less than 5% for both. Truth. This doesn't touch the minimal, but does touch the maximal. We really disagree on what is true. Republicans have very different evaluations of the risk and actual damage of COVID than Democrats. Similar for climate change. Election 2020, the CNN 2022 midterm exit polls showed that 3 out of 4 out of every 10 midterm voters did not think that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. So for those 3 to 4 out of 10 people, we're not even living in a minimal democracy. We're on the other side of that line because he didn't get elected legitimately the president, right? Now, I don't know what you guys thought. I think a lot of us in the run-up to 2020 thought, well, if Trump loses, there's going to be some trouble in the White House. He might not want to go or go very easily. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that 2 years later, about 7 out of 10 Republicans would think he didn't even win the election. I didn't imagine that it would be a mass phenomenon in that way. Mm-hmm. Even more important than disagreement on truth is we have very polarized views about the institutions that we can trust to tell us what's true or not. This is what I call epistemic polarization. So nobody much trusts the media, but Democrats trust it a lot more than Republicans. So 20% of Democrats have a great deal of trust in the media. 3% of Republicans have a great deal of trust in the media. Scientific community. 68% of Democrats say they have a great deal of trust in the scientific community. 32% of Republicans do. And the pivot point, the inflection point, was about 2015-16. Before that, Republicans trusted science more than Democrats. Right now, I actually think that Democrats trust science quite a bit too much, and I can explain why later. Colleges and universities. Do you think that they have a net positive effect on the country? For Democrats, it's 67%. For Republicans, it's 33%. Right? So these are like the media, higher education, and science. These are the three of the main institutions that we rely upon to tell us what is true and what is not. And there is a high level of polarization about whether we can rely on them to do that. And unless we can agree on at least the methods of getting to what is true and what is not, and what will work and what is not, I think we have a pretty sorry chance of solving some of the big existential crises that our country faces. And then finally, the fourth indicator of democratic fragility is minority rule institutions. And so the Electoral College isn't such a big deal without spatial polarization and when we don't really disagree that much. But when Republicans are sorted into low-density areas and Democrats into sharply blue states, and we have a wide range of disagreements, the Electoral College becomes really, really important. So for political scientists, American political scientists, an electoral inversion occurs when the popular vote winner does not become president, right? Because of the Electoral College. And so since 2000, there have been 2 electoral inversions out of those 8 elections, right? 2000 and 2016. The popular vote winner did not become president. And that kind of creates a minority rule problem. You might think, well, but in 6 of them, there was no electoral inversion. So 3 out of 4 is not bad. 3 out of 4 is not bad. That's pretty good, right? But then I will tell you that the only 2 other electoral inversions in US history were in the Civil War period around 1896, right? So 2 of half of the electoral inversions that have ever occurred have occurred in this fragile democracy post-2000 period. So that is a big minority rule institution that becomes hard to explain. The Senate is another minority rule institution. So this is well known in the legal community, but I'm kind of surprised that oftentimes the audiences that I speak to don't know this, and it is worth knowing, that it is unconstitutional for any state in the United States to apportion its House the way or any legislative body the way the Senate is apportioned. That is, before the 1960s, lots of states in the U.S. had a kind of Senate-like body where the members of the upper house, they would represent counties or larger jurisdictions that weren't equipopulous. And then in Reynolds v. Sims and the one person, one vote Supreme Court decisions, the Supreme Court said you can't do that, because it's just not right to have one representative represent 100 more people in one place, and then another, the very same state with a different representative, right? So that's a violation of one person, one vote. But of course we have that in the US Senate. The population of Wyoming is about 68 times less populous than California. So the Wyoming voter in the Senate gets 68 times the voting power of the California voter. And then that raises the question, well, why is it okay in the Senate if it's unconstitutional in any of the states? And the decision in the Supreme Court, is that, that's because the United States doesn't have to follow one person, one vote, because really what it is a fusion of 13 colonies. And to make that deal plausible, you had to have the Senate. But that was a long time ago, and most of the states were not party to that disagreement, or to that particular agreement. So that rationale probably wouldn't fly for many, many Americans. But so the Senate also is very much a minority rule institution whose structure is actually unconstitutional in any political body in the United States other than the US Senate itself. It's kind of remarkable that way. And in some ways, I do think that our two-party system is a minority rule, less formally, more stylistically, more a minority rule system. It is striking to me that about 60 to 70% of people responding to opinion polls right now think that Joe Biden shouldn't be the candidate, and they think that Donald Trump shouldn't be the candidate, yet odds are, they will be the candidates in 2024. So how can it be in this country of 300 million people, you get candidates that like a substantial majority of Americans don't think should, like there's something blocked up there, democratically speaking, not on the minimal view, but on a more maximal one. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like our colleagues to start queuing up on the microphones. We're going to come and try to do a half an hour of Q&A. Before we do that, and we've got to pretty quickly for the two of you. So Pippa, let's mix it up. So we just had the G7 meeting. Mm-hmm. We all feel good about that. I was going to make a bad joke. I won't do it about the president. I won't do it about his age. So, but you know what? You mentioned them. Erdogan, Orban, Modi.
Right.
Xi,
right.
Xi, Putin, they can meet too.
Absolutely.
So we talked about the Washington Consensus, and we talked also about the GDP in the United States not being so far above everyone else. The world is sort of chopping up in the economic level, which reduces our power. I am not a political scientist, but I think that's what was said this morning by Graham Allison. So those, I think we call them authoritarian populists, not Xi, of course, but aligning together and creating a new pole, what does that mean?
So it's really the revival of the Cold War, but under new alliances. And that's really, we've gone through a period where we thought that we were in a new world order and that the liberal was predominant. Through globalization and trade, it was thought everybody would enter. Through processes of democratization and elections, everybody would eventually enter. And through cultural communications, there was a tremendous amount of optimism about how that was going to bind the world together, only to find, of course, essentially from around 2005, 2010, there'd been a growing split, clearly on China and the United States. That was at one stage a fairly positive relationship, been deteriorating. And then with Russia becoming more assertive under Putin. And again, who would have thought, even a few years ago, that he would in every way invade Ukraine, its neighbor, the place which has been really culturally very similar and which has been, so many families have crossed the border on both sides. And then in other places as well, the League of Arab States has just recognized Syria and Bashir, after all the tremendous problems which have been there from the civil war and the tremendous deaths and the exodus of the population. And so around the world we see a new assertiveness of the authoritarian coalition, which is basically countering the G7 and the West. And I don't think we've yet got a proper conceptualization of what these developments mean. I don't think IR is really taking it enough seriously. I was speaking to Joe Nye a little bit about this, but I think we've got to really rethink what the relationships are. Some have been strengthened, like NATO, clearly because it has a clear function in Europe and because they've had so many more resources. Germany stood on its head and turned its defense policy upside down overnight as a result of Ukraine, and they're very solid. Poland has now become incredibly strong for taking on refugees. And there are many other countries which have been transformed as the result of these new things. But essentially, you've got to choose sides. It's us, them, and that's really unfortunate for anybody like probably ourselves who are much more globalist and want to have the United Nations with people coming together and a meeting of people instead of people being pushed apart.
So I'm sorry, graduates of the Kennedy School, you're all elites.
That's true. It's true.
You may not feel it, you may not want to be elites, you are.
The paycheck may not reflect that.
I would, exactly. Tied to education, not your economic, not your net worth. Give a grade to elites around the world. Small countries where it's easier to organize them, I would presume. Large country where it's difficult. How are elites doing in preserving democracy?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the record is a poor one, but the question is a smart one because it recognizes implicitly the importance of political elites in maintaining democracy. And so, this book that I did with Scott Mainwaring called Democracy in Hard Places. So what we did was we commissioned a bunch of case studies of countries that managed to get and keep democracy even though they didn't have all of the prerequisites of democracy. So why were these unlikely democracies able to emerge and survive for such a long time? And one answer that kept coming up again and again and again is that for different reasons, you had in these countries at key moments political elites, leaders of political parties, military leaders, other leaders of big national labor unions, who were all so committed to democracy that they were willing to sacrifice some of their policy desiderata in the service of maintaining a democratic system. And so that commitment to democracy, we think, is really important. And it's one of the reasons I love teaching at the Kennedy School of Government, because there's all these other factors that influence democracy are ones that, frankly, an overweight person sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts like myself has no ability to influence whatsoever. But we do have a little bit of an ability to move the needle on the commitment of leaders in different countries around the world to more inclusive, accountable, and decent government. Call it democracy, call it whatever you want. And so I do think that's one of the things that we at the Kennedy School of Government really need to redouble our commitment to, so that when we send our great global elites back onto the globe, they nudge the needle towards democracy.
So I'm going to ask you guys to do something that'll be difficult. Pretend I'm Joe Nye. Pretend that you we're in class and you may or may not have gotten through the 500 pages that he's asked you to read. I resemble that. And also pretend that if he were sitting here, what he would say is that a question ends in a question mark. And what I want you to think is that you get a high grade for a short, crisp question, and you get cut off.
That's good.
You get cut off for a speech, unfortunately. We're going to take them in threes. Tell us your class. We want to know who you are, your class, and very crisply, your question.
Chuck Rosenberg. The mid-career class of 1993, second to none, sir. This is a domestic, as our laboratory here in the U.S. I'm going to introduce an idea. Maybe I'll put a question at the end of it.
No. The class has spoken. Question.
Here's my question. What do you think about 2026?
Okay. Question.
2026.
Mikiko Sawanishi, MPP 1993. Yes. My question is role and possibility of AI on democracy. It's just because democracy is really try to find the common ground. Now AI is trying to capture our preferences and then our views, and then maybe can really find the common ground. So maybe politician, the electoral system may not be necessary in the future. I just want to know your views.
That's good, AI politicians.
Which AI? Yeah.
Wolf Plessman from the mid-career class from '03. So I was in the class also with Professor Fung at that time about the Iraq, or it was about the Iraq invasion, actually, in the end. We didn't know that at the beginning.
Okay, Wolf, okay, you're my classmate. I can see question.
Yes, I know. So the question is, when I listen to you, I really think there's a big need for constitutional reform in the US.
Yes.
And I don't see a big discussion on that. And I see a lot of people always saying, no, we can't touch it. And that is something I do not understand. Why is it untouchable, and shouldn't there be a discussion about it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good questions.
We have three. 2026, AI, technologies in the effect and constitutional reform in the U.S. Where do we want to start?
You want to go in reverse order? Okay.
Please.
I don't know if we'll even be here in 2026, so I'm not going to even try that. And one of the reasons I wonder if we'll be here in 2026 is because of AI. So in my free time, I've been catastrophizing about the possible impact of artificial intelligence on our world. But even if AI doesn't lead to the ruin of humanity, which some not unintelligent people say, I even heard Sam Altman CEO of OpenAI, give that a 10% probability, and I literally did not eat for a week after I heard him say that. But even if that doesn't happen, many people are predicting massive economic dislocations as a result of AI. The late Ash Carter used to say, everybody's talking about driverless cars. I want us to think about the carless drivers, the folks who lose their livelihoods as a result of these AI developments. And I do think that's a very serious issue. And another issue for those much closer to my area of study, we've been studying the ways that authoritarians undermine democracy all around the world. Think about now the uses to which generative large language models can be put to spread misinformation, to get into online debates, et cetera. So I am very concerned about that. The last thing about constitutional reform, I think, brings up a very interesting dialogue that we could possibly elicit between Professor Fung and Professor Norris, which is Professor Fung makes the point that there are minoritarian institutions in the United States, the Electoral College, the Senate being the most prominent ones. And just as an aside, minoritarian institutions aren't always bad. Right. Some people who make institutional proposals or reform proposals for developing countries or countries racked by civil war often propose these kinds of formulae so that warring factions can reach a modus vivendi. But the point is, as Professor Fung is pointing out, we've got a situation where the will of the majority is often not reflected in the outcome of elections. But Professor Norris pointed out that one of the great threats to democracy is coming from the fact that a lot of people in this society, maybe even the majority, but a lot of people in this society feel that the pace of change is too rapid, right? That social change is just running away, and they wake up every morning in a different country from the country that they were born in, and yet they never moved. And so then you have to wonder if some of these minoritarian institutions, which magnify the voices and power of the group that Professor Norris pointed to, actually has a potentially salutary or useful effect in that it kind of slows the pace of change, gives these people the time to acclimate, or their children to acclimate, and so it serves a useful function, particularly at a time when society is changing so rapidly. I don't know the answer to that, but it seemed like that just came out as a result of their conversation.
The one thing that we didn't touch, Pippa, is democracy expanding between now and 2026, or democracy contracting and under pressure?
I mean, they're both happening in different places. I think sometimes we have a very depressing view in the United States that everywhere is going through what we've been experiencing day by day, and that's not necessarily true. Particularly, there are many smaller countries which have actually been advancing in their liberal democracies over these periods, but they're not necessarily in the headlines, and the headlines themselves are skewed towards negative news. So if something goes wrong, those are the things that we emphasize, especially where there's an analogy. We say, oh, isn't that like the United States? But that's not necessarily the case worldwide. I think a global perspective is important. And the literature is somewhat pushing back on the idea that democracy is declining everywhere, and certainly collapsing everywhere. But I'd like to come back to the questions, in particular the one on the Constitution. The United States has one of the most rigid constitutions in the world. And that's not my conclusion. It's a group of scholars at the University of Chicago and others who founded something called the Constitute Project. You can look it up online. It's really very good. The average constitution worldwide, national constitution, when it's written, lasts 16 years. It's very common in Latin America to keep on changing it, to try and improve it, et cetera, and in many other post-communist countries as well. In the United States, of course, the Constitution really has been around for 200 years, which means it's not fit for purpose. But opening up...
That was quick.
It's interesting, actually. That's a really... That's a really interesting... In part because in America we treat it with such sanctity. And, these guys, almost with white wigs, are looking backwards all the time at what were the founding fathers doing. I don't. I look at it in terms of functions and design, and I look at whether or not it's actually fit for purpose, in the sense that the worst problems of regime stability are where the culture and the institutions are out of whack. They're out of alignment. And increasingly, that's what's happened in the United States. So we have institutions that were designed for a particular period that may well have been great at that time, but haven't had the time to really change in functional ways. So the Electoral College at one stage was actually designed in order to try and make sure that the presidency had a larger majority in the Electoral College than they would in the popular vote. Why? Because they wanted a president who actually had legitimate claims to power and to be able to govern. They didn't want a very tight election. Nowadays, of course, the way that the geography has worked and a number of other institutions means it's not functioning in the appropriate way. Similarly, a two-party system. Obviously, America's gone through various systems over periods. Some people estimate 5 different party systems, but they've always primarily had 2 parties. Most other European post-industrial societies don't do that. Look at Germany, which has always had 5, has now got about 8 parties. Look at Canada. Look at the United Kingdom, which has 13 parties. So most other countries have opportunities for those who are disaffected to still have a voice, to still have a way to get elected, get their members into the legislative process, and therefore to get involved in a coalition. America insists it's us, them. It's that polarization which doesn't exist in a vacuum. The institutions encourage it. Yeah. Winner take all encourages it. You either win the presidency or you lose the presidency. You win the Senate or you lose the Senate. But it's not a system which allows the sort of flexibility which most standard European countries will have. So the institutions don't work. And I can suggest lots of different institutional forms. And again, some countries, think about the United Kingdom. You think that the constitution hasn't changed there forever, because you're always seeing the Queen or now the King and the monarchy and that sense of tradition, right? 1997, Tony Blair came in with a tremendous mandate for the Labour Party, an enormous number of seats. He changed the House of Lords, he changed Northern Ireland and the Stormont Assembly, he created the Scottish Parliament, he created the Welsh Assembly, he brought in electoral reform for the European elections, and he brought in a written Bill of Rights, and he really, the Labour Party transformed more or less within a 2 or 3 year period the British Constitution. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, because we still have all sorts of problems in Britain which need to be addressed. But you can do it. But the question in America is, if you really try to have a serious debate about the constitutional issues, could there be enough agreement in the room that it wouldn't basically get worse rather than better? And that's the big danger. You're opening up the rules of the game. And I think, by the way, the Kennedy School should really play a big role in this. I think it would be an important forum, but we're not neutral. Yeah. And so getting a deliberative bodies around the United States, International IDEA has a very good way of doing that in countries which are divided, to try and get really grassroots participants to talk about the constitutional processes, what they think to be strong, what they think to be a problem, and then always also to look at other countries for constitutional examples. What works in elections? What works in the judiciary for appointments? What works in districting? That's what the world is doing, but somehow America has been insulated from that process, and I think it's something which we can share and really encourage as part of our work.
Archon, you mind if I'll take 3 more and then we'll start out with you.
Yeah, I'll pick a couple of them.
Please.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much. My name is Paul Orajaka. I'm mid-career MPA 2018. Prof, I took your course, Getting and Keeping Democracy, and I took a lot from your course, and I went back home to Nigeria, and I ran for public office. Awesome. But the sad thing is that the reality is the democracy that is being practiced in these countries is difficult to sustain and bring up the right leaders. One of the questions I want to ask is, Nigeria just came out from an election where, if you subject it to the model of integrity that Professor Norris has, it failed everything. But the United States of America, Anthony Blinken, suddenly started giving legitimacy to a sham election. Professor Tarek said something that the United States
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that we get others. Okay. We're taking 3 at a time.
He just started talking about me.
All right.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
So the question is this. The question is this. Countries like the United States that we're looking up to as the bastion of democracy, that should support democracy, is actually giving some form of legitimacy to an election that is not right. So what do we do to sustain such democracy in Nigeria, for instance? And we're seeing this all over the world.
That is a great question.
Great question.
Lucy Nesbetta, another 2003 mid-career. Hi, Kahlil. I want to ask the panel the role which none of you have addressed yet, and that is the role of the mega rich oligarchy and corruption. Because I think corruption just spoils the fun for everybody. We've gone from...
Okay.
That's it. I mean, right?
Okay.
We've gone beyond Dickensian to now feudalism. And what about that with the conversation we're having? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Li Ping, Mission Program 1998. Yeah, nowadays we know that everyone claims they are democracy, even obviously, right, based on your definition, some is authentic, some is fake. So the question here is that without the transformation of those fake democracy, can our democracy today sustainable? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So this is interesting. U.S. used to be the shining light. A lot of people here don't feel we are. What is our role in projecting democracy, and do we have authority anymore?
So several presidents have had democracy summits where I think the flavor of the thing is like, come learn about how you can do democracy from the US. It's an exporting democracy proposition. I, for a long time, have said that's backwards. We should do an importing democracy. What about participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, or the Chilean constitutional process, or citizens' assemblies all over Europe, or multi-party democracy and socialism in Europe, right? There are all of these ideas that are that we should be in a much more humble and learning mode. I wanted to address the constitutional, I'll try to tie them together quickly. The corruption question, I think, is fundamental. There's a great book by Marty Gillens and then subsequent work by Ben Page in which they ask how responsive is American democracy? That is, so they take a bunch of public opinion data and then they take laws and say, hey, do they line up? Do people get what they want? And on issues where people who are richer have different preferences from those who are less rich, American democracy is not responsive at all. It's a flat line. It's just kind of a coin toss about whether the laws you pop out. However, the good news is American democracy on those issues is highly responsive to part of the American population, which is the top 10% of the income distribution, right? And so I think that that is a big problem and has something to do with the democratic fragility that we encounter. I think the U.S. constitutional question is fascinating. I completely agree with Pippa. Ours is harder to change than just about every other one in the world. The last significant amendment to the U.S. Constitution was 50 years ago, which lowered the voting age to 18. That was before electric cars or the internet or mobile phones, right? It's kind of remarkable. That said, on the hope side, there are lots of changes that afoot that would modify the small c constitutional structures in which American democracy operates. Lots of movements at state and local levels for ranked choice voting, a lot of efforts about shifting power over who gets to draw election districts, movements to citizen assemblies. Portland, in its city council charter revision, has created multi-member districts, which I find a fascinating innovation. And I think the pressure, everybody thinks that our institutions are so rickety that I think some of this knee-jerk defense of constitutional provisions may give way in the next 5 to 10 years to some sort of fundamental rethink. And for those of you interested in the Pandora's box problem, I commend an article by Larry Lessig in the most recent New York Review of Books, where he proposes a state-level structure of citizen assemblies that would contain the possibility of runaway constitutional conventions. And then I wanted to spend just a minute on AI, because I think it's a really important question. And first, a meta comment. I find it hard to think through the effects of AI on democracy. And here, I think we're talking about specialized AI, not generalized artificial intelligence. We're talking about large language models, in particular, generative GPT and many others. And so I think the right way to think about that is you have this capacity that you didn't have before of the manipulation of language. And then you have to kind of peer down the stack and say, okay, well, given that capacity, what kind of applications and uses will people put that to? What are their incentives to create those technologies, and will that end up being good or bad for democracy? So what I'm urging you away from is a technological determinism that says, oh, you have large language models, you can read off of that whether it's going to be good or bad for democracy. So a lot of us thought that the internet would be good for democracy, but what we got that wrong because we didn't peer down the stack and say, hey, look, the strongest incentives are going to be to create apps to maximize your engagement in order to sell you advertising, because that's the business model, and that's going to have all of these negative externalities for mental health and for democracy, right? So you got to peer down that stack. And peering down that stack, you can imagine quite good and quite toxic consequences of uses of large language models for democracy. So you can imagine, you know, your preferred candidate, Ted Cruz or AOC, being able to have 500,000 house parties on the exact same 1 p.m. on Sunday because you've got a large language model that's tuned up to give the responses that AOC or Ted Cruz would have. And so for a grassroots organizer, that would be quite a boost to small d democracy. On the negative end of the ledger, Larry Lessig and I are drafting this thing. You know, imagine a gamified version of ChatGPT. We call it Clogger, campaigns in a box, in which Clogger has access to voter files and can conduct its own polling and has the capacity to carry on 200 million conversations over 6 months in the campaign with you and with you and with you. And all it's trying to do is either maximize your chance that it will vote for Clogger's candidate or minimize the chances that you'll vote for Clogger's opponent. And it doesn't know what's true. It has no idea what's true or not true, and it doesn't care. And what it talks about may not be policy oriented at all. It could just simply be like pointing out incontinence ads at the same time that you see advertising from the opponent so that you get a negative association. All it's trying to do is maximize vote propensity, right? And so you play that out and you get a very, very damaging kind of scenario. And then tying back to the Constitution point, many lawyers think that a version of Clogger would enjoy First Amendment protections, that it's not possible to regulate because that counts as political speech, even though it's a box and an AI producing it. And this is where Europe is doing much, much better than the United States. Last week, in the draft of the EU AI law, it's a risk regulation approach, and it said that political manipulation by artificial intelligence is a high-risk category that needs to suffer pretty tough regulatory scrutiny, whereas if the lawyers are right about First Amendment protection for AI, the US approach is just the opposite. Is regulation is not possible of that kind of speech.
So Tarek and Pippa, should we be decoupling the vote from our thoughts about democracy? So in Turkey, it is pointed out that you had some of the highest turnout.
Oh, sure.
Well above what we see in
Yeah.
the United States, but in many Western countries.
There's a poor correlation between the level of participation and the level of democracy, quite simply, because, of course, in the most authoritarian states, which do have elections, they mobilize the vote. They get people out by all sorts of inducements. We talk about corruption, but vote buying is very common, for example, in many places. State bureaucrats have to vote. They turn up in coaches in order to vote. And there are many other ways in which you can expand participation. In other countries, which have had a long tradition, Switzerland is one of the most democratic countries over the longest period in the world, has very low turnout. India has very low turnout. America has relatively low turnout compared with most others. So you can't put the two things together. And what you've got to have is authentic participation, in other words, real choice, and an informed public that's voting because they know what the options are, and they're making choices between a variety of different parties which represent their views and their identities and their interests. And if you don't have that, then of course you're going to have low levels of participation. And just to come back to Archon's point about the states being very positive, they are innovating in a small c way, in all sorts of positive ways. Problem is, we have two different categories of states, of course. And so again,
Absolutely
yes,
true.
For example, on the gerrymandering issue, the democratic states have made big advances in having independent district commissioners, but those have been in the democratic states. Yeah. Gerrymandering's got worse, as we've seen, not just because of the work of the state legislature, but also the state courts, which have reinforced that as well. And so we're getting two Americas in views of the value of democracy. which is even more difficult. If you have differences on issues like welfare spending or how much should go on education or whatever, you can massage those and bargain, as we've seen, and come to resolution. If you have different visions of democracy, of what it is to be a citizen, or what you want from your citizens and how they should be able to participate or have their voice heard in other ways, then you can't agree on the rules of the game. And that's when it's really risky. And that's when you get a rogue candidate comes in who presses on those issues, and how you get to any resolution is very, very difficult. It's like trying to play baseball without an umpire or rules of the game. If you don't have that, you can't really play.
There.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Professor Norris just mentioned is really should give us pause when we talk about things like constitutional reform and advanced, in a place like the United States. I think you're right that our institutions are absolutely showing their age, and there's lots of ways that they could probably be improved if we got a random sample of Kennedy School minds to kind of come up with what the ideal constitution would be. It would probably be better. But once you open that kind of set of decisions, it can be highly disruptive. And so the small c reforms that Professor Fung and Professor Norris are talking about seem to me to be ones that have a lot of promise. And that just brings me to the last thing I want to say about the part of the world that I study, which is, I particularly focus on the Arabic-speaking Middle East, but just developing countries in general, where, we would be so lucky if we could have the kind of conversation about improving democratic quality that we're having here about the United States. That would be a dream for us. One of my friends from Egypt said to me once, Tarek, imagine if we brought Donald Trump to Egypt. He would instantly be the most liberal politician in our political landscape. And so to, if you just keeping that kind of comparative comparison in view, I think those of us who work in these contexts should focus on the small. Right? So I always say, if you want to fight patriarchy, it's important, absolutely, to try to do it at the national level, but recognize also the limitations. So create an enterprise that is itself anti-patriarchal. If you want to fight despotism, open a business in which you make decisions democratically. And I think these are the building blocks through the broader social and ultimately institutional change will happen in the parts of the world that lack even the flawed democracy that you experience here in the United States. And I'd say that with our students, I'm much more optimistic about that, having been a Kennedy School professor, than I would be had I not been. So
I'm going to apologize to my colleagues who waited patiently at the microphone because we are at time. But we're going to do one last thing. I really am sorry. We just couldn't get it all in. We need more time, but that's the quality of the panel. What we agreed to is that we're going to give one thought of something that each of you would like to see, or it could be a call to action for this community. And we'll start with Pippa, please, to help improve democracy.
Well, in some ways, I think it's a change of our attitudes, and it's part of what Archon mentioned about learning from the innovations which are going on around the world. We seem a bit isolated, really. We're looking, when we think about other places, we think about Iowa or we think about Michigan, but we don't really think about many of the cases which are really fascinating. For example, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which started in South Africa and have really taken off as a way of getting over this bitter polarization after a major event like the insurrection, where we could start to have those who are part of that maybe involved with some of those who are victims and talking to each other. I mean, that would be a radical thing. Or think about participatory budgeting from Brazil, which again was brought in a number of different cities there. And we've started to see it in other places, in Cambridge, for example. What are your priorities that you'd like to see spending on? And expand on those as well. And other issues, I'll mention a third one just briefly, gender quotas. Gender quotas have taken over around the world. Now, are they necessarily the way to get women power? No. Sometimes they're very limited. Sometimes the women are appointed and they're not autonomous and they don't have the independence they need. But it has been an effective mechanism to give women a voice, even in very traditional societies, because the UN has been committed to gender equality. The SDGs are committed to gender equality, and there's been enough focus on that in different countries that the world has agreed that that's a representational issue that we can work on together. And gender quotas, again, can really double the number of women in office overnight if they're effectively designed. And we kind of know how to do that nowadays. So I think there are things we can do, we can learn, but we need to learn from each other. And often those who've come to the table last are the ones who've been innovating most because they've had to. And so we can think they don't have to follow the old models. They don't have to follow Westminster. They don't have to follow the US Congress, which is not a model for what other democracies should be. But they can learn from each other. South-South cooperation is absolutely critical. The international community can assist, in particular USAID, with Sam Powers in that role. The Biden summit is not saying this is a model that you should follow. That's not the way that they're approaching it. They're saying, what can you do as a country? What are the commitments you're going to make in order to strengthen your democracy? Give us a list and we'll learn from each other. And that's been very much a model which, again, has produced 1,000 flowers. We'll have to see how far they bloom. But I think is, again, a very positive way. And national ownership is a vital commitment, not having us going over there to tell them what to do, having them say, we've got this problem. How can we learn from another way of dealing with that problem? What are the policy ways that other places have tried to get over ethnic conflict, or get over issues of increased religious tolerance, or improve the legislature to be more effective, or improve the public administration to be able to deliver public services, which is so vital, or to have elections which are really run, which are free and fair and with integrity. And that's what we're doing. But it's often behind...
I assure you that Pippa asked me to make sure that we stayed on time.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
She asked me, I assure you.
Shut up. I'll be
I
quiet.
assure you. We made it contract.
We did. That's good.
Tarek, please.
Oh, I just think I will go very, very, very micro. We are obviously living at a time where people evince a great deal of discomfort in hearing opposing points of view. And we at the Kennedy School, I mean, there's a stereotype of the Kennedy School, the political commitment of the average Kennedy School person. I think it's really important for us to be agents of inclusion, and that means inclusion of political viewpoints that we might not necessarily agree with. And so I would say one of the most important things that I think this community could do could be to become agents of the creation of space for opposing points of view, right? We are now in a world where everybody wants the day of judgment. There's an old Arab poet who said, maybe it was a Persian poet and I made him Arab, who said we should seek not the day of judgment, but the day of understanding. And I think we can be part of that.
That's great.
Last word to you, Archon.
I agree with both Pippa and Tarek. I'll go big. I think if I had a magic wand, it would be multi-party democracy in the U.S. I think there should be a Biden party, a MAGA party, a Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney party, a AOC Bernie party, maybe a Joe Lieberman, Andrew Yang party. And I think that would make things better.
This was absolutely terrific. Thank you to our colleagues, and thank you everyone else.
That's me, the Proud Boys party as well.
Thank you, Archon, Tarek, Pippa, and Kahlil for an amazing discussion. We are getting close to the end of the day. We've moved the evening reception downstairs in Wexner Commons due to the weather. Information on your class dinners can be found in Hoover or the registration desk, or will be displayed on monitors above Wexner Commons. Thank you.